3 disturbing true New Year's Eve horror stories. Number 1. The Midnight Caller. It was New Year's Eve, and Sarah was looking forward to a quiet night. She had just moved into her new apartment a few weeks ago, and she hadn't had the chance to settle in completely. The excitement of ringing in the new year alone didn't bother her, she liked the solitude. As the clock approached midnight, she decided to prepare herself for the moment of celebration, opening a bottle of champagne and sitting down to watch the ball drop on TV. Just as the countdown began, Sarah's phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Thinking it was a prank or telemarketer, she decided to ignore it. The phone rang again, and this time, curiosity got the better of her. She answered, but there was no one on the other end, just heavy breathing. Confused and a little unsettled, Sarah hung up and turned her attention back to the TV. Suddenly, the phone rang again, and this time, she noticed a strange noise, a faint knocking, almost like a door tapping. She looked around, confused, before hearing the sound of footsteps in the hall outside her apartment door. Sarah froze. She hadn't heard anyone outside earlier, and no one had been expected. She crept over to the peephole. Through the small circle, she could barely make out the figure of a man, standing completely still, his face obscured by shadows. The knocking continued, now faster, louder. Her heart raced as she dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher. But before they could respond, the knocking stopped. The footsteps retreated, and the sound of the man's breathing returned to the phone. Sarah backed away from the door, trying to gather her thoughts, her mind spinning. The phone call went silent, and when the dispatcher finally returned, Sarah told them what had happened. When the police arrived, they found nothing outside. No sign of the man. No sign of a break-in attempt. But they did find something else, a small piece of paper tucked under her door, scrawled with a single line, "I'll be back next year." Number 2. The Haunted Countdown. Tim and his friends had made a tradition out of spending every New Year's Eve together. This year, they decided to rent a secluded cabin deep in the woods, far from the city's chaos. The night started off as it always did, with drinks, laughter, and the excitement of the countdown. As midnight approached, they gathered around the fireplace, preparing for the new year. However, something about the atmosphere felt off. The air was heavy with an unease that none of them could place. Tim, trying to ease the tension, jokingly suggested they play a ghost hunting game. Everyone reluctantly agreed. They decided to explore the upstairs rooms, which had been locked during their stay. The attic door creaked open, revealing a dusty, forgotten space. At the far end, they found an old, wooden chest, which looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Tim, feeling brave, opened it. Inside, there were old photographs, faded and torn, and a collection of strange, unsettling trinkets. But there was one thing that made his blood run cold, a small, intricately carved clock. It looked almost exactly like the one in their living room, which had been counting down to midnight since the evening began. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. As the clock struck midnight, the power in the cabin flickered, and the temperature dropped. The laughter stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The clock in the attic began ticking louder, and one by one, the friends turned to see that the clock in the living room had stopped, its hands frozen at exactly 12 o'clock. They tried to leave the cabin, but the door wouldn't open. Panic set in as they realized the windows were also sealed shut, as if the house itself was trapping them inside. One by one, they began to hear whispers, faint but distinct, emanating from the walls. The voices spoke in unison, "You're here forever." The clock ticked on, but it wasn't counting down anymore. It was counting up. Tim and his friends spent the rest of the night trying to escape, but no matter what they did, they couldn't break free. By morning, the cabin was silent once again. The clock stopped, and the door finally opened. The friends, exhausted and terrified, left, vowing never to speak of the night again. They never found out who owned the cabin or why it seemed so cursed. But every year, just as midnight strikes, they hear faint ticking sounds, and whispers that follow them wherever they go. Number 3. The Silent Party. For as long as Emma could remember, her family had always thrown a New Year's Eve party. It was a tradition, friends, family, laughter, and dancing. This year was special, though. It was going to be the last party before she left for college, and she had promised her parents that it would be unforgettable. The evening started normally. Her friends showed up, music played, and everyone enjoyed the festivities. As the night wore on, Emma felt more and more disconnected from the party. Her friends seemed distant, laughing at jokes she didn't understand, making inside comments she wasn't part of. It felt as though they were ignoring her. She went upstairs to grab her jacket, only to find her parents sitting in the living room, talking quietly to a few guests she didn't recognize. Strangely, the music had stopped, and the lights were dimmer than before. The guests weren't dancing or chatting, they were just sitting, staring into the darkness. Emma felt an inexplicable sense of dread as she noticed the time, 11:59. The last minute of the year, and something was terribly wrong. Before she could process what was happening, the clock struck midnight. A loud crash echoed through the house, and the room went silent. Emma turned to look, but all of her guests were now gone. Her parents were still there, but they didn't move or acknowledge her. In fact, they seemed frozen, eyes wide open, lips frozen in smiles that didn't reach their eyes. She tried to call out to them, but no sound came from her mouth. Panic set in. She ran downstairs, but the house had transformed. The music was gone. The lights were out. The decorations had decayed into something twisted and grotesque. Emma stood in the doorway, staring out at the street. The familiar sounds of New Year's Eve celebrations from the neighbors were gone, there was only silence. Terrified, she looked around, realizing that she was the only one who could still move, who was still breathing. And then, from the corner of the room, a whisper reached her ear, "You'll never leave. The party never ends." The door slammed shut behind her, and she realized, with horror, that she had become part of the endless night.